is Mykhailo. I'm a director of new Geopolitics Research Network. It's a new created international think tank platform, which is going to make some new approach on the instrumental using of the geopolitics, like a very practical one. And the one of the idea of this NGRN, a New Geopolitics Research Network, to collect, to join, to get together the great experts to make some synergy of the process of analysis and estimations, and maybe combine some researchers together, because the trends now that we have a lot of think tanks in every countries, but we don't have the hubs to get together to talk on the regular basis on the news, on the trends, on challenges and threats on the regional and global base. Now we are starting the first event of our platform with a great topic. I think that the topic was proposed by Dr. Fedorov, and the topic is that intermediate range missiles in Europe, arms race, conflict deal. I think for everybody in this auditorium, in this event, everybody has own memories on the intermediate missile range legacy. I would say the INF Treaty, because for somebody, INF Treaty is symbol of end of the Cold War, because it was signed in 1980s between United States and Soviet Union, on the time when it was a lot of new hopes for new changes in the world. But for somebody, could be the crash of this INF Treaty in 2019 is a symbol of could be a symbol of a new Cold War, because a lot of questions arising because of the end of this INF Treaty. Should we sign a new agreement? Should we find a new way, or maybe it should be better to leave the situation like this and try to build more and more missiles and set these missiles everywhere and start a new arms race. So I'm happy to have together with me a great team of panelists, a great speaker, great researchers. I think one of the best team in our region, maybe globally. I will present shortly our speakers. Ambassador Sergiu Celac, Honorary Chairman of the New Strategy Center, Romania. Ambassador Celac is a legend of Romanian diplomatic service with long success story in different spheres. He is career ambassador and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania. Ambassador Celac, you're welcome. Dr. Yury Fedorov, professor, leading international expert on international security issues, including energy security, arms control, strategic armaments, tactical nuclear weapons, anti-missile defense, and missile warning systems. Dr. Fedorov originally is from Russia, but for a long time already is living and working in Europe. Yury Evgenich, you are welcome on the board. Thank you. Dr. Tomasz Smura, Director of the Research Office of Casimir Pulaski Foundation, Poland. He focused on the military technologies, arms industry, US foreign policy, security of East Asia region, and global trends in this sphere. Tomasz, Mr. Smura, you are welcome. Dr. Wilfried Jilge, he's an Eastern Europe and mediation advisor, Ukraine, at the Center for International Peace Operations, Berlin, and Associate Fellow of German Council on Foreign Relations, Germany. Dr. Jilge, you are welcome on our event. And Mr. Mykola Bielieskov, research fellow in National Institute for Strategic Studies, Ukraine. Major areas on his research and scientific interests include international security and regional security in Europe, foreign policy and strategies of the USA, Russia, China, Japan, and foreign policy of Ukraine. Without any further delay, I'm going to start our discussion on the topic. We'll have approximately 2 hours for our discussion with 2 rounds for speakers. I think it's enough time to have a deep and comprehensive discussion on our topic. One technical announcement: we are going to record our discussion and publish the most interesting videos at the new Geopolitics org and the YouTube, of course. Now I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Fedorov, who actually proposed the idea of this event, and I think Dr. Fedorov will set the scene on the topic, and after his speech, we'll discuss the issues in details with our speakers. Yury Evgenich is up to 12, maybe 15 minutes for you. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mykhailo. And good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased and proud to be at this discussion. I think the topic is really important, and the set of experts is really very, very well known and great. So let me start that we all know that the INF Treaty has collapsed a couple of years ago because of development and deployment in Russia of so-called 9M729 cruise missiles. There is another acronym used in NATO, SSC-8, which is much more pronounceable, I think. So, according to some Western sources, Russia has, at the moment, at least in last year, had 4 missile brigades armed with these cruise missiles. And in total, there are somewhere about 100 of these missiles. There are different assessments of the number of missiles. It depends on composition and structure of missile brigade, type of launcher, and so on. Anyhow, the normal and mostly used assessment is about 100 missiles at the moment. It is safe to assume that these missiles are intended primarily for strikes against military and key political targets in NATO countries and in Ukraine, I would say. Also, some of them perhaps can be used against Japan, or perhaps against China. We don't know. But I think that most of missile brigades which are equipped with these missiles are intended to be aimed at Europe. Well, I think that Russia fell in the trap it dug for the West, in fact. Because since the crash and because of the crash of the INF Treaty, the USA are developing, or is developing, sorry, several immediate range systems, both missiles and cannons, or one cannon at least, to counter Russian and Chinese weapons of the same range. And in the wider context, I would say to strengthen the deterrence capacity in Asia and in if to look at the latest National Defense Authorization Act for the current financial year, well, this document mentions at least 6 of such systems. Most of them are ballistic missiles of different range, between, I think, 1,000 and several thousand kilometers. Precision strike missile with a range up to 700 kilometers, and a new system, so-called strategic long-range cannon, with range up to 1,500 kilometers. Also, there is under development a land-based or ground-based version of Tomahawk cruise missiles. Well, we don't know, of course, how and to what extent those plans and development of these systems will be fulfilled. But according to American military sources, they should be ready for deployment. They will achieve initial operation capability in year 2023, perhaps some in 2024. Well, I think that if those, or at least some of those systems deployed in Europe, in some areas close to or nearby, located nearby Russian borders, they could be a kind or will be a kind of a game changer. If deployed, they essentially change the balance of military force, preventing Moscow against aggression against Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, perhaps Georgia, and so on. At the same time, one may expect that perspective of such deployment will initiate a very hot discussion within NATO, within European states, especially those states on which soils this deployment may take place. I'm sure, and we all know, I think, that several NATO member states are opposing any deployment of such systems in Europe. And NATO's position is also known. Not once Mr. Stoltenberg said that NATO has credible deterrence and defense, and it can achieve this deterrence without mirroring what Russia does. Official or semi-official position of NATO is that if this organization starts to deploy the same kind of immediate range nuclear weapons in Europe, as Russia has done over the last years, so there will be a high risk of launching a new arms race. It's true, of course, but at the same time, I would like to say that arms race is already launched by Russia, which is developing and deployment of new systems aimed at Europe, including air-based hypersonic missile Kinzhal and some others. Well, besides, albeit it's not decided in the USA where the new intermediate range systems will be stationed, American military implies that they will be deployed not only in Asia, in the so-called the first chain of islands nearby China, but yet in Europe too. There are some information that a new operational tactical group of American Army will be deployed in Europe, armed with the new systems. So thus, two options are appearing. The first one is to station these weapons on the territory of states located nearby Russia by bilateral agreements with those states, with the United States. There are, of course, pros and contra for such an option. It may be fraught with a crisis within NATO, yet it will, at the same time, it will improve the deterrence capacity of the states. So we have two different motivations, either to keep NATO to prevent crisis in NATO or to increase the deterrence capacity. The second option is to make a deal with Russia. For many, it would be a preferable way out of the problem. Well, but what are the prospects of this deal? At the moment, Russia's position includes 3 points. It may be summarized as 3 points. The first point is to establish a moratorium on the deployment of Russian ground-based intermediate and short-range missiles until the US-made missiles of similar classes appears in the respective regions. Second point is that some verification measures concerning the Aegis Ashore systems with Mk-41 launchers that are deployed at US and NATO bases in Europe, namely in Poland and Romania, as well as to cover the SSC-8 missiles at the military sites in Kaliningrad area only, or Kaliningrad region only. To confirm the absence of ground-based missiles of these classes at the areas covered by agreement. So Russia is ready to, at the moment, Russia is ready to employ some verification measures, but in Kaliningrad areas only. At the same time, Russia is ready, as Mr. Putin has said in October last year, Russia is ready to continue not to deploy these SSC-8 missiles in European part of Russia, but only provided that NATO countries preclude the deployment in Europe of the weapons prohibited under the INF Treaty. Well, to sum up this position, it means that Russia will not deploy SSC-8 missiles in Europe, provided that NATO precludes the deployment in Europe of any American intermediate range system. And verification measures concerning the Kaliningrad regions and Aegis Ashore sites in Poland and Romania. Well, in my understanding, I do not think that Moscow takes this position seriously. First, it's very easy to move the SSC-8 missiles and launchers from the eastern part of Russia, especially having in mind a very important point in my understanding, technical point still important, that those launchers and those missiles are compatible with all other components and infrastructure of Russian missile brigades equipped with Iskander missiles. And there are a few of such missile brigades in the European part of Russia, in the southern military district and in the western military district. So it's not even, it's very easy to move launchers and missiles and to adjust it to the existing infrastructure. And secondly, it's important that Moscow proposed to exchange one Russian system, I mean SSC-8, for 5 or 6 American weapons. This is a good deal, in fact, but for Moscow only. So I expect that in the final end, if the serious negotiations starts, Russia may agree with elimination of these SSC-8 missiles. Something like has been done with so-called SS-20 missiles in the 80s in the last century. But the question still are, what could be done with other Russian intermediate range weapons, such as Kinzhal hypersonic missile and so on, which are aimed at European targets. And should European states located nearby Russia to refuse weapons that substantially strengthen their deterrence capacity in exchange for only one Russian system, which is SSC-8. So these are open questions, in fact, and perhaps we can discuss those questions right now, and maybe this discussion will be the first one in a series of some other events for deeper aimed at deeper understanding of the problem in question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fedorov. As I expected to set, and I think that they put all of possible aspects of the situation and the topic to our speakers. So it's very easy for us will be start discussion. I think that you're absolutely right that, for example, Poland and Romania, actually as Ukraine as well, is pretty positive on the developments with domestic and United States weapons developed to put on the territories to deter Russian threats and challenges on this sphere. Like for Ukraine, is obviously that Ukraine is going to develop own missiles, but I think that Mykola will talk about it later. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Celac with a Romanian understanding of the situation, with Romanian position and Romanian prospects on the developments, as Dr. Fedorov told, that with different variants of the developments of the situation. Ambassador, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mykhailo. I would like to begin by saying that a word of thanks is certainly due to the organizers of this event and personally to Mykhailo Samus, because the event is quite timely and the subject matter under discussion is of great relevance for regional and international security. Certainly for Romania's national security as well. Now, a few words on the background. The current international context has been shaped by the new realities of power in the world arena and dramatic technological developments which have touched in particular the military sphere. We are living in a different world compared to the Cold War and immediately post-Cold War period. It is not easy to characterize this period properly. Is it a post-Cold War reality or something new which requires a proper description? The COVID-19 pandemic has acted as the catalyzer and accelerator of these complex processes of change. In late the New Strategy Center has produced a book. Here it is for you to see. Post-Pandemic World, Perspectives of Foreign and Security Policy. It comprises 37 contributions from leading scholars and political leaders and practitioners from 3 continents, trying to look into the future, how the world and international relations will shape up after the pandemic is over, because it will be over one day, some way or another. Looking into the future, my own prediction was that arms control in the broader sense is likely to become a priority subject for world diplomacy in the coming months and years, even though the legal and negotiation mechanisms which were shaped during and immediately after the Cold War have recently fallen into bad disrepair. Some tentative steps have already been taken by the Biden administration, even before it served its first 50 days in office, such as extending the New START treaty by 5 years as a prelude to subsequent substantial negotiations. Needless to say, my own contribution to this volume was about arms control. Arms control, oh, there you are, in a shifting international security environment. My assumption is that there has been an autonomous development of new, more sophisticated weapons enabled by top-of-the-line technologies, which make most of what we know about arms control and disarmament negotiations, if not irrelevant, at least badly obsolete. I started my diplomatic career as a very young junior member of the Romanian delegation to the 18-Nation Committee on Disarmament in the early 1960s. And I remember the rhetoric, the hopes, and the disappointments of that time. Now we are living in a different world, and we need to accept that we need a change of mind to absorb and cope with the new realities on the ground. Clearly, any negotiations leading to a deal, in particular on intermediate missiles, conventional or not, are to be preceded by diplomatic soundings and consultations with allies and partners to ascertain the willingness of the main actors to proceed with a coherent sequence of steps and to establish how far they are prepared to go. With more than 90% of nuclear arsenals in their possession, the United States and the Russian Federation have a special responsibility to make meaningful progress possible. And that explains also the reluctance or reticence of our Chinese colleagues to engage in any arrangement on armed controls or armaments reduction at a time when the main nuclear arsenal of China is about the same as that of France, which is nothing compared to the more than 12,000 nuclear warheads in the United States and Russian arsenals. So I expect there will be a cautious beginning of soundings and probing and creating the qui pro quo to be later traded for the concession of the negotiating partners. And intermediate range missiles will be undoubtedly part of that process. In the meantime, we shall witness a lot of posturing and tactical, rhetorical outbursts in order to soften up the position and the possible scheming of the negotiating partners. In any event, my assumption is that those discussions will not be confined to a mere resuscitation of the INF Treaty of 1987. Realistically, it will have to be much more comprehensive in order to account for the spectacular technological breakthroughs leading to the development of new instruments of warfare and their expansion into other areas of possible confrontation, such as cyberspace, outer space, infospace. In the coming months and years, I would bet on months rather than years. Transatlantic cohesion and solidarity and enhanced NATO deterrence and defense posture will be crucial. Managing the different perception inside the European Union and between the European Union and the United States concerning relations with Russia will require patience and wisdom. The least thing we need is a heated debate on I'm right, you are wrong, but rather wise and quiet exploration of the limits of what is possible and what is not. And that is why the German elections and other electoral events this year and the next in Europe will be watched with, I would say, at least interest, especially in the eastern flank countries such as Poland and Romania, and the partner countries such as Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Enlightened pragmatism should not obscure the obvious fact. The Russian land grab after the Georgian War of 2008, and particularly the military occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea, plus the continuing armed intervention in southeast Ukraine, marked the end of a persistent illusion. It is time, after so many years of conflict, to wake up to the realities of the ground. The threat to European security is real and present, and it requires a united and determined response. Beyond legal niceties on the interpretation of the so-called Minsk Accord in particular, and elaborate rhetoric accompanying those legalistic arguments, we have to face the fact and the consequences of naked aggression and territorial conquest here in Europe. As a frontline country, Romania is, of course, interested in getting better and more knowledge about what is about to happen. The NATO alliance is more solid and effective than ever, with renewed commitments from the United States and progress in the development of the alliance's strategic concept. It is a resilient and reliable instrument for collective security, deterrence, and defense. But it has rightly been said once that security begins at home. So let me tell you about what we do in Romania to that effect, in focusing in particular on the subject matter of our today's debate, namely the development of and acquisition of hardware, which is relevant in the context of intermediate range missiles. In the colorful history of Romanian domestic politics, there were two instances when a national consensus was reached by all political parties represented in parliament. First, it was in 1995, when it was decided that NATO and EU membership were Romania's main strategic objectives. And second, when the aim of spending at least 2% of GDP, gross domestic product, on defense for the next 10 years at least, with at least 20% earmarked for new, modern, effective, and reliable equipment. A target which, in fact, has been overshot in the past couple of years. A lot has been accomplished since that engagement, but much remains to be done. Here are a few examples illustrating the progress made in the field that are relevant for the specific subject matter of today's conversation, namely the intermediate range missiles. First, we have acquired 7 complete Patriot surface-to-air mobile systems. One already delivered in 2020 and currently operational. The others to be phased in 2 tranches of 3 systems each over the next 4 years. A modernized version of the Hawk missile, 8 batteries, initially purchased in 2004, and the planned acquisition of short and very short air defense system, SHORAD and VSHORAD, will operate in an integrated layered mode with Patriot missiles. Those will replace entirely the legacy Soviet systems, still in the equipment of the Romanian armed forces, such as Volkhov, Kub, Asa, and Strela. The Aegis onshore anti-ballistic system based at Deveselu in southwest Romania has been fully operational for the past several years and has proven its worth in theaters of war across the world. And the same applies to Poland. For the surface-to-surface mode, Romania is introducing 3 HIMARS mobile systems with 54 launchers with ranges up to 300 kilometers. The first unit was delivered in February this year. And for the land operations of the Romanian army, it is receiving 100 mobile units of LAROM and APRA multi-fire reactive system, jointly developed by Romanian companies with Israeli companies on the basis of the Russian Grad concept, the well-known Katyusha vintage weapon of the Second World War. For coastal batteries and equipment of Navy missile patrol boats and other warships, the legacy Soviet Rubezh systems are being replaced with modern NATO-grade units with ranges up to 80 kilometers to start with. So I would conclude by saying that in the tense international context of today, the fundamental question before military planners and political decision makers is, what kind of war should we be prepared if it comes to a crunch? And what we need in order to be able to resist and repel any aggression, at least in the initial stage. As a NATO member and a strategic partner of the United States, we in Romania are in a more favorable position than ever before. But we have to do our part of the job, and we will do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Celac, with comprehensive report on the Romanian position. And you absolutely support previous speaker, Dr. Fedorov, that it could be dividing inside of NATO and Europe positions. Because I could predict that in Germany and other countries in Western Europe will have a different position compared to Romania, Poland, and Ukraine, for example. As we a little bit lost on our Poland speaker, I'd like to give the floor to our German participant, the Dr. Wilfried Jilge, on the German positions, because I think it will be some different understanding of the situation compared to Romania and Poland. So, Dr. Jilge, floor is yours. Please, 10 minutes, if it's possible.
Yes, I try. Thank you very much, Mykhailo, for inviting me. My name is Wilfried Jilge. I'm not a specialist in weapon systems, but I'm more a specialist in the geopolitics of two regions which are very important here, that is Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. And I would like to put your discussion, Mr. Fedorov and Mr. Celac, into the political context primarily. I also very frankly tell you that I'm also in a mood of thinking about these things. I'm thinking about still how to better protect Ukraine, for example, the security of Ukraine. And I very frankly say to you, I still have not a final answer. And I think it is very important that the topic we have here raises still questions we have to answer. I think the discussion still has just started. What I would like to tell you also, I'm also part of a strategy group of the Bertelsmann Foundation, where we are analyzing how key states behave in European neighborhoods, including Russia in the Black Sea region. And I would only like to tell you that we just made a big policy paper, Antagonisms in the European Neighborhood, Geopolitical Ambitions in the Black Sea and Caspian region, where I contributed with an article on Russia and actually on the growing up of intermediate range missiles also in the Black Sea region, the establishment of H2 HD zones or like bubbles, which are established like in the Baltic regions. If you are interested in that study, which also came out in English and where I'm very thankful to my Ukrainian colleagues like Michael Samus, who were prepared to give advices. You can tell Michael, and then Michael tells me who is interested, and I will send you the link, or better, the direct PDF version. Yes? Okay. What I would first to start with is on Europe. We should debate the threat potentials of different intermediate range missile systems, which have been developing in Russia so far, more in a political and geopolitical context, and in the context of multi-level answers from the side of NATO. What I have in mind. In order to give legitimacy to that discussion in Europe, and Mr. Celac already touched the very difficult situation in the discussion in Europe, it will be important at first to engage much more in education and enlightenment. What is going on in the Baltic region, in Kaliningrad? But I think here is the situation already much better. But actually, what is going on in the Black Sea region? In the view of Bulgaria and Romania, as well as Ukraine and Georgia, a constellation of similar vulnerability to that of the Baltic states in the Baltic region is developing, with Crimea playing a similar role in the Black Sea region, like that of Kaliningrad in the Baltic Sea region. The difference between the regions is in the fact that the problem in the Baltic states and in the Baltic Sea region is more firmly anchored in the consciousness of EU and NATO allies, actually in Germany, than the increasingly apparent imbalance and threat situation in the Black Sea region. So it is already much more easier to discuss in Germany your questions, because we have in the Baltic region already a set of, let me say, systems of trap wires where NATO can build up further responses to the threats you told us. That is already a discussion which is more established. And we should also take into account that it would be possible not to begin with the stationing of intermediate range missiles in the context of our discussion, but to build up continuously defense measures which we have and where is perspective to go on. For example, air defense is very important also, not only intermediate range missiles. The second point, what is very also important is what I think what was mentioned by Mr. Fedorov. We should, and we are still not in that situation. We still must have joint diplomatic initiatives as first to bring the threats from the side of Russia on the table. And I do not only speak about the missile threat. I speak about undermining of international law. I speak about SNAP exercises, which are closing up whole sea territories in both regions, in the north and also in the south. So it is important, if we want to gain legitimacy for a better defense in European public, and we spoke about the elections in Germany, we have to much more louder identify and bring on the table what is going on in the region. That is very important. The third thing, which is very important, is parallel to the proposals made by Mr. Fedorov, for example, concerning strengthening deterrence by deployment of intermediate range missiles in the territories near Russia, we should connect it with a clear perspective that Russia should be provided with opportunities for cooperation in security and confidence building measures, arms control and disarmament. So the first step should to use the grown leverage of new developed weapons in America to use as a bargaining tool in such negotiations. So on the one hand, to be firm that NATO is prepared for also a military answer, not in the sense of militarizing the situation, but of deployment of what is needed in the face of that threat. But on the other hand, there should be a parallel and systematical diplomatic approach on confidence and trust building measures in order to test Russia and in order not to give Russia the opportunities to interpret the initiative from the side of Europe or NATO as an offensive step. We should underline, actually in the sphere of information war, that is very important, that that the NATO side, the European side, have good reasons to think about such answers, and as well as to make clear that is a step of defense of allies and friends in the region, and that there are good reasons to be defended. That is very important. Situation in Germany, very difficult, very difficult. On the one hand, Germany is a very solid NATO partner. You see that also how Germany provides the Baltic states with support in air defense. So there is no discussion on that. That is absolutely logical. It cannot be put into question in Germany. It's very difficult to put that into question. On the other hand, and Mr. Celac and Fedorov spoke about the changing world. We have at the moment, and I would not criticize that, but we have the fact, and you see that how Germany has much difficulties also to find a new way of behavior towards Russia. Yes, it's very contradictory. On the one hand, Germany keeps together the sanctions in the European Union. I think without Germany, the sanctions maybe would have been already revised in a sense that we should make the sanctions cut down into different pieces. So if Russia makes one checkpoint open, yes, we can have a little bit lesser checkpoint, lesser sanctions in Donbass. No, Germany here is very firm and says only if there is a complete settlement in Eastern Ukraine, sanctions can be lifted. And that is not given for, let me see, granted in European Union at the moment. That is the one side. The other side, you see how difficult the discussions towards Russia are when it comes to pipelines, when it comes to other things. So Germany, and that is a problem, is in a situation, Germany is searching for a new role. Germany is facing many expectations from sides of Ukraine, which has become, we can say, almost a strategic partners when we see the engagement in reforms of Germany, decentralization reform, justice reform, also other things. The engagement of Germany in Donbass is very big. We have now a Ukrainian department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We never had before for a country beyond Russia, such an department, yes. So there's a big capacity building also in Ukraine, but on the other hand, you see Germany's approach is still not systematic. It is also caught by domestic politics. So we have a coalition where you have on the one side a transatlantic, a very fierce and clear transatlantic standing, represented by, let me say, foreign policy special politicians from the side even of Social Democrats. The Minister of Foreign Policy is quite stable when it comes to NATO. We have a Christian Democratic Party, which is all in all pro-NATO, pro-US. And you see that the Minister of Defense, Mr. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, has already made statements actually on your topic. We have to search for an answer of the growing threat by such missiles. That is already here. On the other side, you have very influencing parts in government, persons in government, and in coalition factions who are still trying to continue selective engagement, so-called selective engagement with Russia. So there is a thinking that you can, in some fields, you can cooperate and you can fully isolate them from all other situations with Russia. That is still continuing. And you have even a very serious discussion in Social Democratic Party, and we do not know about the fate of that party in the coming elections. on the nuclear participation of Germany in the nuclear umbrella granted by the US. What is also a new discussion, which is of course inspired by, let me say, the legacies of peace movements. Yes, Michael reminded us to the NATO double decision in the end of the 70s and the big conflicts in Europe when it was about Pershing II. SS-20, we all remember that. We have there also a strong wing, and we should not ignore that. We have also very ambivalent situation in the Green Party. The Green Party, on the one hand, I would say, is one of the advocates of Ukraine at the time in Germany. It is very interesting. That party, which actually came out of the peace movement, has developed to one of the advocates of Eastern European Partnership neighbor countries, also when it comes to European perspectives and even when it comes to security issues. But that is actually a perspective mainly represented by leading figures. We have still a basis in that very important party. I mean, we should take into account the Greens are now the number 2 in Germany, not the Social Democrats. The Greens are the number 2, and they have perspective to build up the coalition, maybe with the Christian Democrats. But that does not automatically mean that the discussion in Germany will be more clear, because you have also, let me say, a difficult green basis, electorate basis in Germany, and that is not identical with the leadership. That is the situation in Germany. Thirdly, and here I would like to discuss my last conclusions, if I may, dear Mykhailo, on the example deployment in Ukraine. Yes, possible deployment of such intermediate range missiles in Ukraine. First of all, I think we should more take into account domestic factors, as well as in US, as well as in Ukraine. When it comes to Biden administration, we now have, let me say, a big enthusiastic wave of comments from Ukrainian stakeholders, which are accentuating actually the, let me say, expected support by America in security issues, partly a little bit ignoring the reform agenda of Mr. Biden, which is actually for the Biden administration, for Blinken, and I just had also communications with the expert community around the Biden administration, very important when it comes to Ukraine. And so we see that Biden said America is back. But what does it mean? For Biden, America is back because America will lead by example of domestic politics. That means that Biden will have a priority in domestic politics in order to make that example, good example, soft power example of America applicable in the global politics. But that means also that Biden will not decide everything alone, that he will be engaged only in coordination with partners, that he will be engaged only on the basis of burden sharing. So to expect that Biden will quickly run to Ukraine and open perspectives like deployment of such missiles is wishful thinking of Ukrainian establishment. Excuse me for that. Second point, for what is the problem for the America? At first, we should strategically really think, and that is my open question to the missile question. What is the need for NATO to deploy in countries like Ukraine? What is the need to deploy weapons of a high symbolic and military importance nearer to Russian counter-strike forces, where Russia can better reach out to them than if they are deeply stationed in other territories of Europe, if they have really the capabilities they were expected to have, like Fedorov told us. So that is really a technical question, which is important. So what is the need? What is the need if Ukraine is not member of NATO? That is also a question. Will NATO defend and be engaged in ground forces deployment in Ukraine? No, not next time. Do not expect that. Will America be ready to do that? No. Why? it is not important to put in the Ukrainian steppe some weapon systems of intermediate range missiles. You need state use, you need programs, you need education of forces. And I think if America only after long negotiations delivered a Javelin to Ukraine with very limited operational freedom for Ukraine's commands, then please imagine what does that mean for intermediate range missiles of top quality. I mean, Javelin is not a bad system, but in 3 years it is already an old system and nothing else. But even with the old system, the Americans were very, very cautious and careful to fully give autonomy to the Ukrainian command because they fear two things: strategic mistakes, which is, I think, a thing which has weakened because Ukrainian army made big progress in last years. We have now a strong, experienced Ukrainian army, actually these. But the problem is also corruption, and the third, they don't want to have to sold weapons to third parties, to give it ironically a little bit. And we have a third problem, that is intelligence. The Americans and the Europeans, and please take that into account when it comes to deployment in general of weapon system for Ukraine. No one trusts at the moment the SBU as maybe an open gate for intelligence problems. So what I want to tell you is not, that is normal. Yes, Ukraine is in a difficult process of reforms. I do not criticize that because we have here legacies from other governments before 2014, which are still have not been answered. So please understand me correctly. I do not think that Ukraine is only bad in making reforms. Absolutely not. But if we speak about such sensible military issues, these issues are also count, and you have a link between domestic reforms and military security deployed from external partners. That is important, what I want to mention. So to conclude, I think that we should understand two things. When it comes to Ukraine, and for me, Ukraine is really a high heel of European security at the moment. It is the European question of security #1. Please let us have no illusions. If we don't solve the Russian conflict, or better, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, to begin with the aggressor, we will not solve any other questions with Russia. That is the problem. That is really the main problem, also actually for the Europeans. So we should take into account why has Russia interested being aggressive against Ukraine, and that is that we have a think tanks to explain to our stakeholders. It is not about Donbass. It is not about a piece of territory of eastern Ukraine. It is about the southern flank of Russian geopolitical design. It is about to have a dominant control between the Caspian region over the bridge building region like the Black Sea region until Syria. Yes, that we have Eastern Mediterranean. We have to take that into account, and that is possible if NATO and European allies, and here has begun a discussion, what makes me more and more optimistic, only if the partners of Ukraine makes their domestic homework and contain Russia in that wider Black Sea region, then the pressure on Ukraine will weaken. And the second point is Ukraine has to be made resilient in domestic politics, not to give gates to Russian influence. And in that wide range of possibilities, we can very much do for Ukraine that the cost for Russia to attack Ukraine will be so high when it sees the cost will be high, and they will not reach the main aim, that is not only Ukraine, that is a wider Black Sea region, then you can contain that. And to be clear again, I will not rule out, and if negotiations will have no result, but that should be now on the table, we of course have to formulate as NATO an answer against the threats of the intermediate range missiles. What I'm pledging for is a systematic diplomatic approach step by step in order to build up legitimacy and leverage on Russia to be here on the right side, also when it comes to information war, and thus prevent Russia from, let me say, malign influence in that questions on unity in Europe and NATO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jilge, for your excellent, comprehensive geopolitical picture of the situation. You told about several tracks in the developments, and I think that, of course, Ukraine is not going to get American weapons yet. I mean, intermediate range missiles, for sure. You are right that it's a lot of problems on negotiations, and I think it will be great if we got some naval system. It will be excellent results for Ukraine. Not, of course, about such missiles, but for Ukraine is I told about this paradox that in Ukraine very positive got this news about the crash of the INF treaty, because Ukraine finally got the opportunity and possibility, actually, officially possibility to develop such a missiles domestically, because Ukraine theoretically actually has the technology to develop, design, and produce such missiles. I think that Mr. Bielieskov now, well, logically continuing the great speech of Dr. Jilge and explain us what is the situation in Ukraine, what is the position of Ukraine towards INF Treaty and the future of INF Treaty because of Ukrainian position in Ukrainian-Russian military conflict. Because for Ukraine, it's a question of life, actually, and death. Rather, get this intermediate range missile domestically produced. Maybe we could solve this problem getting some missile defense system, but unfortunately Ukraine, of course, won't produce it by itself. But in this situation, United States is a first partner for Ukraine. I mean, a missile defense system procurement. So, Mr. Bielieskov, please, floor is yours. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mykhailo, and thank you, Dr. Jilge, for this interesting presentation, because I will tell in advance that my ideas, actually, you voice some ideas that I'd like to voice, especially not to rush with missiles and not to make our steps, common steps, more legitimate. But first of all, I would say that my position is my personal position. It's not official position. It's not representative. The position representing Office of the President, the National Security and Defense Council, National Institute for Strategic Studies is looking for. So it's only my personal ideas. First of all, of course, the damage of INF Treaty in August 2019 negatively affected Ukraine, because now Russia can credibly threaten any part of Ukraine using missiles that were prohibited by the late INF Treaty, and procure them in bigger quantity, as land-based missiles, as we know, are much cheaper than sea or air-based missiles. And at the same time, of course, Ukraine has neither proper finance nor capacity, at least now, capacity to respond systematically to this new dimension of Russian threat. Compared with Mykhailo, I'm more restrained concerning our potential, because we have this overview of Romanian modernization program. Alas, Ukraine cannot afford even the modernization of conventional armed forces on the scale of Romania. We have more and more meager resources. So that, even now we don't have this analog of Iskander, of tactical operational range missiles in our army. So for us to dream about the missiles of the range of 500 and 5,500 kilometers, I think it's not starter as non-brainer. As to the possible arms race in Europe after the damage of INF Treaty, I am not that pessimistic, because as for me, the situation in the next couple of years will not be acute as it was back at the end of 1970s and the beginning of 1980s. Why? Because luckily Russia this time is not USSR, and Russia has smaller industrial technical potential capability to procure and deploy missiles with proper ranges compared with USSR. Dr. Fedorov said about 100 missiles. What is 100 missiles, especially if it is in conventional payload, not with a nuclear payload? If it's in conventional payload, it's very, very little. Because we have this example of US strikes in Syria in 2017-18. They and their allies, France and UK, they used more than 150 missiles to destroy just 4 targets. So, given the fact that Russian industrial potential is not that big, so at least it will take some time for Russia to get this arsenal, proper arsenal of a couple of thousand of missiles with a conventional payload to credibly threaten Europe and to cause the same feeling as it was back in the back 40 or 45 years ago. And plus, for Russia to openly threaten Europe with INF-30 missiles is to lay the same preconditions to repeat the situation with Euro missiles. But now, of course, the US can place countermeasures hypothetically closer to Russia's heartland, and they would be more threatening, given shorter flight time. As for the US side of the equation, because for the arms race you need 2 sides at least. And the US side of the equation is not that good as it was under Ronald Reagan administration to start at unlimited arms race. Because, for instance, back at the time, US spent approximately 6% of the GDP for defense. Now it's 3.5%. And as we know from the US media, for 2022 fiscal year, the Pentagon budget will be flat. So there is no chances for increase after COVID pandemic, after negative economic repercussions. It will be something like 704 billion or 708 billion. And again, we have in the Congress Democratic Party controlling both chambers, and I think they will be more circumspect. They will. They are not in favor of the arms race. We see this prolongation of the START agreement, and I think it's. I think to say that Democrats will be in favor of the arms race, I think it won't happen. And even now, among different branches of U.S. armed forces, specifically between Army and the Air Force, we have this debate. Who should be responsible for long-range fire on the theater of operation? It's a very telling debate because it means that all these systems now under development or consideration, they would not be procured, all of them, because there is a lack of resources. So for arms race to materialize, the U.S. also is not that good shape. Even also very good example, U.S. Marine Corps, they asked in this financial year for 50 Tomahawk missiles to be procured for them for the Indo-Pacific region, and Congress said no. So we have a lot of examples, a lot of indicators that not only from the Russian side, but also from the U.S. side, this time U.S. is not as ready, at least for Europe, to procure and to deploy these missiles, these systems in a proper range. And if we imagine this hypothetical situation that, well, Russia produced and deployed missiles in proper quantity and in proper age, and the US is ready to do it, then I totally agree with Dr. Jilge that we need to proceed very carefully. We do not need to rush. We need to follow the example of Ronald Reagan, because if we remember that when he came to power, he first said to the USSR, he suggested that we're not going to deploy this Pershing 2 or Tomahawk land-based missiles if you are ready to remove SS-20 missiles and other missiles of this range. When USSR said no, then US proceed with this deployment in 1983, starting in 1983, and from this position, from such approach, this deployment was more legitimate. So, because I totally agree that we need to fight for legitimacy. We need to make each step legitimate in the eyes of the world community. Because on the other hand, if US rush to deploy in a lot of quantity these new missiles of intermediate range in countries closer to Russia, I say that we will have Cuban missile crisis in reverse, because Russia would perceive the threat. Yes, it may sound very strange that I'm somehow defending Russia. I'm not defending Russia. I just want to look to the situation from the Russian lens. And they would say, for instance, that if you reacted in 1962 to the USSR effort, why our reaction should be another one? And we have these vicious circles of measures and countermeasures. And we have this Russian paranoia of 1941 attack that brings them closer to the damage, to the actual collapse. But this time they would say that NATO is planning it to do with missiles and fighters. So US, NATO, and partners like Ukraine need to proceed very, very carefully, not to create the situation when Russia can appeal to the world community and say, well, they are doing things that are threatening us and they leave us no other option than to respond forcefully. And by the way, I don't think that even this time, relying just on bilateral agreements, it will be possible to circumvent NATO. Why? Imagine the situation that US is ready to place missiles in Poland, and Poland is also ready to host these missiles. But placing those missiles in Poland means the possibility of the escalation. And a possibility of escalation means that US should be ready to respond. And how it will respond in the end for the possible escalation? Using German airspace, using German seaports, using German land infrastructure. So, and not only Germany, in the end will say we need to our voice to be heard. And that's why we'll have this situation. So it will be difficult to circumvent NATO. In the end, and by the way, my personal idea that Russia this time been more restrained compared with the USSR, not that threatening, at least publicly with missiles. They will try to rupture NATO, NATO solidarity, playing this difference in a position. So we need to be very careful, because for Ukraine also NATO solidarity is very, very important. As to Ukraine, first thing, according to the Ukrainian constitution, there should be no permanent foreign military base. So we need to make changes in case there are plans to place these missiles. And the next most important thing, most important question is whether NATO, whether the US, first of all, is ready to go in a possible escalation to the very possible end. Because Russian reaction will be negative one, and the very possible end is all-out nuclear war. And then we remember that there is this kind of asymmetry between Russia and the US concerning Ukraine, and the Russian threats are more credible, and credibility is everything. So the scenario of a possible placing of missiles in Ukraine, we should not, of course, imagine it or consider it, but we need to be very, very careful, and Ukraine needs to have this kind of guarantees that if something happens, something wrong happens, US is ready to go for the Ukraine to the very, very well. And this example with the javelin is a good one. It takes for Ukraine 3 years, more than 3 years, to persuade to provide this tactical item of weaponry or with a tactical impact. The issue of intermediate range missiles is much more important. So basically, the issue is the following one. If we imagine the situation, the placing of missiles won't happen overnight. It's not possible to do it in just 24 hours. And which means that the inherent risk of placing will be with us from the very beginning. And Russia can say, well, we started the war, so-called preemptive war, because we need to guarantee that we're not threatened. And the possible benefits, I would say, will come in a time. And if they come, it's also an open question whether US is ready to go for Ukraine till the very end, till the nuclear escalation. That's why it's a major issue of concern for Ukraine. From my point of view, we need not only to see pros, but also cons. of such a possibility. But again, we of course shouldn't at all withdraw this option, shouldn't consider it at all, but we need to proceed very, very carefully. The next important moment as to the possible solution, well, if we need to proceed from the following assumption: the more demands we make to Russia, I mean, the more items to be included, Russia will also demand more and more. And this time, Russia could say, well, US needs to remove from its arsenal not only land-based missiles, but also sea and air-based missiles. Because if sea and air-based missiles are preserved, then US preserve this asymmetrical advantage. And if we talk another demands like placing of forces, restriction of placement of forces, Russia could start talking about the European security architecture in general, because it's more connected with the security architecture in general, and who knows whether this issue of Ukrainian neutrality will be raised and whether or not it will be preferable for the European partners. So we need to be very careful. And the last but not the least, I think, talking about world after INF Treaty, we forget to talk about this elephant in the room, and this is China. Basically, the China was the main reason, also in addition to the Russian violation, but China was the main reason why US withdraw from the INF Treaty, because they have this emergent geopolitical confrontation, and they have this situation when China is not restricted and the US is restricted from deploying these missiles. And again, to imagine the situation that luckily in Europe we have this regime to control these missiles, and there are none of these missiles, and at the same time US, for instance, is having these missiles and deploying them in Asia. Russia can say that, well, US have these missiles in Asia, what prevents them from moving them to Europe? So maybe we should talk not only about Europe, but about comprehensive regime. But again, China could have the same reservation as Russia, so that we need to talk not only about land-based missiles, but air and sea-based, especially sea-based missiles, where US still have the lead with Tomahawk missiles. At the same time, well, it's only my hypothesis, I think Europe will be somehow preserved from this armed race, this time, active armed race. The major arena of the missile arm race, this time of the ranges of 5,500 kilometers, will be Indo-Pacific region. And given the fact that US resources are constrained and Indo-Pacific theater is a priority #1, and also remembering that Russia was the country that first brought the idea of either revising or destroying INF Treaty, because other countries, China first of all, are procuring these INF missiles. So basically, Russians back in 2007 were saying that we also need these INF missiles because we have China problem. And they still need it despite all this talk about friendship, because Western military district is the weakest one, and they have this great disparity of potentials between Russia and China. And for Russia, these missiles in the Far East is also an asymmetrical mean, especially with nuclear warhead. So I'm talking about that maybe this time, not given some kind of agreement, but given that geopolitical circumstances are working and are heading for the Indo-Pacific, each of three major players, I mean US and Russia, but also China specifically, they will all concentrate their missiles all they can afford this time, because funds are constrained, means are constrained. They will concentrate it in Asia, and by just happenings, by lucky coincidence, Europe somehow will be spared. That's my idea. Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to talk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bielieskov, for even more complicated picture of the situation than before. As I understand it, we've got more complicated understanding of the situation now than before the event, and it's great. Especially thank you for adding here China, because it's absolutely clear that without China and maybe even more players in Asia, it's impossible to imagine any comprehensive agreement on the new level of intermediate range missiles, if we're talking about a real success in this story. In this situation, I'd like to ask to join to our discussion our colleague Yury Fedorov. He is the head of the Asian section of New Geopolitics Research Network and sitting now in Almaty in Kazakhstan. So he is a fill-in not Asian, I mean not European, but Asian air. And I'd like to ask you, Yury, to give us a couple words about the Asian understanding of this problem. I mean, INF Treaty crash and maybe some prospects, especially for China understanding, but not too long. I mean, couple minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mykhailo, Samus, for organizing this great event, and thanks to the speakers for very comprehensive reports. I would like to very briefly transfer our attention to the Asia, because in this regard, the destruction of INF Treaty is often associated with the fact that China, and Mr. Bielieskov mentioned that, the China not being a member of the treaty was able to significantly increase the number of medium-range missiles in a short time, which began to threaten the security of the United States and its allies in the Asia-Pacific region. And the Chinese position is that China owns a much smaller number of intercontinental missiles compared with the United States and Russia. Therefore, accusation of militarization as well as need to be joined to INF Treaty are unfounded from the point of view of Peking. And I took part in a security forum in Beijing last year. This is Beijing Sunshine Forum, including roundtables on the INF. And the Chinese experts say we have the smallest number of missiles if we count all categories together. Let's reduce the numbers of other countries' missiles to the Chinese number, and then we will discuss the involvement of China. And this is their very, very clear position and very strong position. So far, efforts to involve China in the treaty have no result. And given the growing contradiction between the United States and China, further militarization of the region, including missile weapons, is not ruled out. And from the Kazakhstan point of view, they are very negatively see on the situation or on the destroying this INF treaty because they more likely to proceed this process of demilitarization, of peace development, and something like that. And I do have two questions, maybe very briefly, to Dr. Fedorov and to Mr. Sergiu Celac. Sorry if I pronounce your name incorrectly. And the first question for the Dr. Fedorov is, how do you see the development of the situation in the Asia-Pacific region between China and United States? And how can this affect Ukraine, if there is any effect for Ukraine, if it could be? And the second question to Mr. Sergiu Celac, what can NATO do to contain the threats or challenge from China, taking into account the changing position on China in NATO's new strategic concept that is developing now? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yury. As we understand it, China doesn't have any motivation to participate in new agreement yet, so we should create this motivation. But to be honest, I don't see any possible instruments to do it now. Now, if you don't mind, Dr. Fedorov and Ambassador Celac, please answer the questions. So Dr. Fedorov, Please answer the question of Yury. Thank you.
You have to unmute.
Please, yeah, unmute. It's on the bottom of the monitor. You have a microphone.
Okay. So it's really very important question about the triangle China, USA, and Russia. Well, in my understanding, I think that discussions in the United States, what should be American policy towards China is going on, and it's perhaps too early to outline the basic dimensions and the vectors of this future strategy. What is clear, I think, is that China is considered by American political class and military establishment, both in the Biden administration and not only, as a main American, if not enemy, but main sorry, main competitor, and perhaps not only in economic but also in geopolitical sense. The question is, what could be American approach to Russia in the light of growing not controversy but contradictions with China. I think that perhaps the main idea which is under discussion in the States now is that it's necessary to find some solutions of the so-called Russia's question, or Russian question, because it's important to improve the security situation in Europe, between Europe and Russia, to improve the security situation of the frontline states in Europe before, as a condition to promote effective policy on the Chinese track. So we cannot, I think that we cannot divide American strategy, American international strategy, which is under development at the moment, into two different and independent vectors or tracks, Russian and Chinese. They are tightly connected, and a condition for, as I've said, the condition for effective policy towards China is to establish more security in Europe. So,
Ambassador Celac, please answer the question.
Yeah. All right. First, I would add an observation to Dr. Fedorov's reply, namely that there is a visible difference of nuance between the professional administration experts and the majority feeling in Congress. Not only Republican, but also a majority of Democrats are eager to show that they are able to be tough on China. And that complicates the task of the administration to move, as they prefer, more cautiously and gradually in relation to China than the preceding president used to do. Now, on the specific question to me about NATO potential role in Indo-Pacific, I think that that region is way out of area for NATO, and not comparable even to NATO's limited role in Afghanistan, which was in fact, and Iraq, which was in fact an invocation, the result of the invocation of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty from the very beginning. So I would see a majority NATO preference not to be actively involved in any saber-rattling rhetoric and action in the Indo-Pacific, in particular in the South China Sea. We have all noticed that Germany decided to send a Navy ship into the area in a show of freedom of navigation principle. But that is a far cry from an actual active material involvement of NATO in that area. I would emphasize in particular that Secretary General Stoltenberg of NATO, in his public pronouncements, always makes a clear distinction between Russia and China in terms of strategic confrontation. While Russia is seen as a potential adversary, China is seen as a systemic rival and competitor, but never was China mentioned by NATO officials as a potential military adversary. So I think that would sort of cover your question, Mr. Poitsda, if you are satisfied with it. Thank you.
I think that now we could proceed to the finalization of our event. I'd like to ask all of speakers now for final remarks, maybe with some reaction on the previous speakers' reports and ideas and propositions and some conclusions of other speakers, maybe about the forecast for the future, maybe new propositions for next discussions. Please, 2-3 minutes for some new points, what you'd like to ask for us. Thank you. Mr. Dr. Jilge, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the great discussions. Really a great event. I very enjoy it, and we should continue that. First of all, I would join Mr. Celac on China. I think we need a strategy for European neighborhoods, how to encounter China in terms of hard security as well as wider security. We need independent trade rules where international law and inclusivity is granted and established. That means we should also invest, and that is a problem of security, in deep sea ports, in ports where energy can be transformed, because that is also a possibility. Also, for example, to deploy their partnerships, military ships, yes, of allies. That is very important. Look, a good example is a big problem with the Anaklia port in Georgia. It is crucial for the connection between Europe and Asia, and it has a direct signal to China and Russia, because it would be a signal of European Union, NATO, and its partners, Ukraine and Georgia. We are present in that region, and for us, it is important what happens in that region. Please take into account that Russia is working in terms of a creeping annexation. Russia is aggressive, but Putin is a very calculated man. He only is attacking when it is successful and when he is not being observed how he is acting. That is very important. Therefore, my proposal is, at first step, also to support Mr. Bielieskov, we need a joint monitoring system for crucial regions like the Black Sea, the wider Black Sea regions. And it would be nice, for example, to have a European project of integrated think tanks like your network, like, for example, Kulimenko's monitoring group, like, for example, our engagements in Germany, that we could, for example, provide European and NATO stakeholders with a common information basis. What is going on from international law until armament with such weapons, until the subjects of human rights in Crimea, and so that is, everything is connected one with another. Yes, Crimea has become a castle because it has a security function. Therefore, we have a bad situation of human rights there, and so on. So we should here have monitoring. We should have wider security. And we should have more discussions with Mr. Fedorov and Celac, who can tell us in, let me say, old Europe, more in detail about that threats. Because, for example, when I put on the table these problems with Russia, it is very easily for people of the other camp, let me say, to play with all these numbers and weapons. Yes, and therefore, we need here, Mr. Fedorov, what you told us was very important, and we need your information to have on the table in closed workshops with our stakeholders. We have to open that question. That is the situation we are. The next point I will tell you one I would like to complete what was said here. We should take into account that when we speak about how available these new American weapons are for Europe or not, we should not exclude the possibility that the American will pose them maybe only on ships. Because for the American is very important flexibility to regroup these weapons between Asia and Europe, and maybe not to be drawn into negotiation with these very difficult European governments, with these coalition governments where everything is so difficult and takes a long time. So for me, it is not granted also now that we immediately get these weapons in Europe when they are operational. That should be also a part of our discussion and dialogue with the Americans already today, and not only tomorrow when that question will be on the table. Very important. And all in all, we should really be again more. We should have European countries, Ukraine as a very deeply associated country to Europe, and the US. We should develop also more understandings for our threat perceptions, and that is something I want to conclude with as a German. As you see, I'm absolutely aware of these threats, and I'm try to be engaged with our Ukrainian partners and European Romanian partners how we can answer that. But you should have taken into account that there is also a legacy in the heads of Germans of the Cold War, because it is not forgotten that Germany would have become the main platform of the main battlefield in Europe And that is so important. That is also the importance of INF Treaty for those countries like Germany, Austria, so everything what is in the center of Europe. That actually that treaty was to make, if he was affected or not is another question. But in the minds of people, it was something that protected us from being again the potential battlefield of a nuclear or other forms of wars. What I only want to tell you is you have to reckon that, and you have to take into account that when you have dialogue with the Germans. And I think we also, as think tanks who have in mind cultural context, I think that is important. We also should work on better understandings, as I try to make better understanding of Ukrainian situations, a land what is in a deep reform process, at the same time still at war. I try to explain that to the Germans. You should imagine the threat perception of a Ukrainian who knows tomorrow everything can be destroyed. Every reform tomorrow can be destroyed, because we already experienced in 2014 that from one day to another, things can totally change. That is what I try to explain to the German and Central Europeans. So we should have a mutual dialogue on our perceptions, and then tell that are the facts, and we should tell and explain the facts in the context of that perception. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jilge, for your again comprehensive picture on the situation and your propositions. Now I'd like to ask Dr. Fedorov for the final remarks. Yury Evgenich, 2 minutes, please, 2-3 minutes.
Thank you. I think the discussion was really very interesting and fruitful. Let me start by saying that I'm old enough to remember discussions in 1970s, late 1970s and 80s about Pershing II and SS-20 in Europe. And the main points the main points which we have discussed reminds me what was under debates more than 40 years ago. The same problems, how the Soviet Union would react to American Pershing II and Tomahawk, what is the best way to provide security in Europe, and so on and so forth, what could be the position of NATO, and so on. So what was in my understanding the main lesson of the past is that it was Pershing II, deployment of Pershing II, which made the INF Treaty possible. And the basic question at the moment is, in my understanding, it's my second point, not only to discuss the missile question, which is under debate at the moment, but how to improve, how to strengthen the security of the frontline states in Europe. That is the basic point. And in my understanding, I would prefer, of course, a deal which will make possible to avoid deployment of American missiles in Europe, new American systems in Europe, intermediate range system in Europe, as well as elimination of Russian weapons of the same classes. The question is, as I've said before, what could be Russian systems covered by this deal? It's an open question. The other point which I think it's important is that American programs, American missile programs and new weapon programs to develop new intermediate range weapons is a product of the bipartisan consensus. Democratic members of Congress and of Senate, as well as Republicans, they agree with development of those systems and are ready to spend a few billions of dollars according to the the current American military budget for the development of those systems. Military programs has its own inertia, and if the weapons are developed, then the question is where and whether they should be deployed. I think it's only logical to assume that the question where these weapons are to be deployed in Asia or in Asia in Europe too will be of practical discussions in the United States soon. And position of the American military is quite clear at the moment, at least as far as I can judge. They should be deployed in Europe too. It's a reality. And then what should and what could be discussed, how to use this prospect to improve security of frontline states, including Ukraine. It's an open question, and I don't know the answer. I very much hope that we together will find the answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fedorov, on the this question. I mean, the panoramic view of the situation and the forecast for the future. What actually the topics we should discuss in our next events. Ambassador Celac, please, your final remarks.
Yes, I would say that one of the things that we shall have to develop and deepen in our internal discussion within NATO and with our strategic partners in the United States is that more should be done to strike a reasonable balance about the attention given to the two crucial tiers of the eastern flank of NATO and the European Union. The same attention intellectually and conceptually to the Baltic and Barents area, where the problems are serious, and the Black Sea Balkan area, where the problems are dramatic. Let us not forget that most of the so-called frozen conflicts are in that region. And most of the potential, in the Black Sea region, but most of the potential hotspots are still in the Balkans, which is a European responsibility. What other reminder is needed to enhance the importance and urgency of taking a good hard look at the southern tier of the eastern flank is that 13,000 people have died in war in Europe in the space of just a few years, less than 10 years. So I don't want to over-dramatize the problem or to say that we feel neglected. We are not. But we have to strike a better balance between the intellectual approaches to the region and the actual facts on the ground. Secondly, I think that coming back to the main subject of this conversation, that any bargaining in a bilateral mode between the United States and Russia, because that is how it has to be. They have the wherewithal and they have the strategic interest as great powers to do something about it. But those discussions on substance will be necessarily preceded by more consultations within NATO, by the United States with NATO, and also by the United States with the European Union, because the European Union is seriously developing a sort of strategic autonomy, whether it is now real or not, but it is a clear aspiration which may come true one day. So our American friends and allies will be well advised to start consulting with the friends before going into battle with perceived adversaries. And finally, a word about the Russian imperial ambition. In all the frozen and not so frozen conflicts, what the current Russian leadership seem to care about is establishing a military presence, a military foothold whenever they have the opportunity. That applies very clearly to Ukraine. It applies because of the strategic value of the unsinkable aircraft carrier Crimea. That applies to Georgia because of control of Voенно-Gruzinskaya Doroga, the military highway, Trans-Caucasian highway, and the littoral portion of Abkhazia, where the main submarine base of the Soviet Union used to be stationed. And that applies also to Transnistria. Well, whatever small and militarily insignificant that's presence may be, it is very jealously guarded and preserved. And when I asked an important figure in the current Russian political administration, why do you need such a presence? What do you intend to do? It is, in PR terms, it is costly. And what gives it to you? And the answer was very characteristic. In Russian, it was "avos prigodится." Maybe it will come handy one day. That's the philosophy of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Celac. Thank you, first of all, for the cold shower of reality, that this is background on our discussion, that we have a war, we have 13,000 killed people in Europe, that this is even, I think it's absolutely different reality even we had in 1970s and 1980s, because in that time we didn't have any war between NATO and Soviet Union, and it was a Cold War, but now we have actually the hot war inside of Europe, and of course the trust and confidence between Russia and the United States, between Russia and NATO. I think we cannot compare even to the Cold War times. So, Mr. Bielieskov, your final words for our conference, and floor is yours.
Thank you, Mykhailo. I will be brief. First of all, I think we did a great job, actually, because we discussed different scenarios, a lot of hypothetical. Now they are more hypothetical, because for arm race we need a lot of quantity missiles was. Now the situation is not that active, actually, but we really discussed different scenarios, and I would even say that a lot of practical ideas, propositions that could be implemented were even discussed. So it was a great thing. I think we over-accomplished, not accomplished, but over-accomplished everything, because we heard different perspectives, different ideas, and somehow the truth came in portions in different presentations. My main idea is that missiles is not an issue itself. As for Ukraine, the issue is security. Everything else are instruments. And how we preserve Ukrainian security and regain territorial integrity and ensure European and Euro-Atlantic integration is another matter. So we need to be careful, we need to be steady, we do not need to rush, and I think it's really important. Everything is about legitimacy and unity, because for Russia, I think much more important is not just to threaten Europe with missiles, but to rupture this transatlantic link. And I think there is a real danger this time that Russia, using this INF treaty, post-INF treaty world, this issue, they can rupture. If, for instance, we have this situation of US forcing countries to take these missiles, especially Germany or other countries, to take these missiles, I think the situation will be even worse than in 1980s. Even in 1980s, it was very, very bad, because I remember speaking with Ambassador Pfeiffer, who was working on this issue from the US side. He admitted that getting this decision at that time of placing missiles in Europe brought NATO to the point of rupture and brought NATO to the point of no return. So this time, I think it will be even more difficult, especially luckily given the fact that Russian threat is not an active one. So we need to be careful not to concentrate only on the Russian missile threat, but to this threat that transatlantic unity will be destroyed. And for Ukraine, it's much more important to have this transatlantic unity preserved, a unity of effort in the sanctions, in assistance. So we need to be careful. We need to weigh chances, and security of Ukraine is a major issue. Everything else are instruments, and we should be very careful and not to underestimate any options, but to be very careful with this regard, because we are on the frontiers of this fight with Russia, and alas, compared with Poland or Romania, we do not have now the security guarantee. So US doesn't guarantee not for us anything. So, but in the end, I think we did really great job. Thank you very much, everybody, and for organizers and for you, Mykhailo, especially for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Mykola, for your really interesting intervention and estimations on our event. I think, well, for my final remarks, what I find, so my findings as conclusions for our event, that we have gaps and vacuum, not only in INF treaty problem, but in strategies. We don't know what we should do with American missiles in Europe. We don't know what we should do with Ukrainian missiles and American missiles in Ukraine, what we should do with China, what we should do with Russia, actually, and what we should do in Black Sea, because we don't have any solutions for joint approach by NATO and partners even in Black Sea, without any INF treaty or missiles details problems in this. So I think it's great that we start with this problem, because this problem paradoxically open our eyes for next steps that we should discuss maybe in future events on Black Sea, on maybe on future NATO strategy, because very soon we will have a next summit on the NATO, and I think that all of these questions should be on the table during this summit, because all of these questions forming a strategy of the NATO for next years, maybe next 10 or 20 years. So I think that we really made great job. We've got a great ideas. I think we will make some texts and make some videos to publish it, to make it publishing for a great public our findings, because I think it will be great to share these ideas and propositions for other experts, our colleagues, and maybe for general public to understand what's going on and how complicated is the situation around not only in Ukraine, but in NATO, European Union, and actually globally, without strategic understanding that what should be the next Western civilization geopolitics in general understanding. So thank you very much, colleagues. I hope that you enjoy our event, and you're welcome to participate in the next events by New Geopolitics Research Network. Thank you very much, and see you soon.